So we have a lot of work today in our message, so we're going to jump right in, but I just want to give us a really quick review of where we've been already in the life of Joseph in our series. We've been breaking down Genesis 37. We're going to go all the way to Genesis 50 and breaking down the life of Joseph. So on the screen for you, here's kind of a summary diagram of what we've seen so far. Joseph's life has been a roller coaster ride that's taken him, we saw, from the pit to Potiphar's house, to prison, to the palace, and we've seen that all of this has been under the divine sovereignty and orchestration of God, and it's all His providence. His brothers hated him. He was so favored by his father. They beat him up. They threw him in a pit, and that was all part of God's plan. He was sold to the Ishmaelites as a slave, and then Potiphar, a high-ranking official, buys him as a slave, and then he gets into Potiphar's house and finds some success, but then Potiphar's wife schemes to try to sleep with him, and that's not a good thing, and all of a sudden he refuses, and all of a sudden she accuses him of rape. That lands him in prison, like roller coaster ride. He gets to prison. All of this is under the providence of God. And then the cupbearer and the baker did something wrong. These are two officials of the Pharaoh. They land themselves in prison under the oversight of Joseph in prison. The cupbearer and the baker both have dreams. They need an interpretation for the dreams. Joseph interprets the dreams. It lands the cupbearer out of prison. It lands the baker dead. That's what happens. And then the cupbearer forgets Joseph. Joseph says, "Remember me when you get out. Remember me when you get out of prison." Here, he forgets him for 2 whole years. That's been a painful time for Joseph. That's been a delay for Joseph's life. But then Pharaoh, we saw last week, had 2 dreams. And that's the very purpose for the delay. God wanted Joseph in prison for 2 more years until Pharaoh had the dream that Joseph needed to interpret. Then the cupbearer happens to remember that there was this guy named Joseph in prison who interpreted his dreams. He tells the Pharaoh calls for him, Joseph interprets his dreams, and they develop a strategy to preserve the land of Egypt from famine, a famine that's coming. And Joseph now is second in command in all of Egypt, in the palace. What a roller coaster ride. He's second in command. He's in the palace. He's putting together this strategy that will preserve the land from famine. And this is where we pick up our story in Genesis 42. So if you have your Bible, turn right away to Genesis 42. If you don't have a Bible, you can slip up your hand, and one of the ushers on either side would love to put a copy of the Word of God in your hands. And if you don't own a Bible, that Bible will be our gift to you. We'd love you to take it home and read it and have your life changed by the Word of God. Now, remember I told you at the very beginning of this series that this whole story of Joseph is not really about Joseph. It's about the purpose of God in redemptive history. We've rehearsed all of that. If you're visiting us for the first time, I encourage you to go back and check out the messages, because you'll understand why Joseph is not about Joseph. It's about a grander purpose. But we also said at the beginning that there are also some key lessons for us. Remember, the Apostle Paul told us that all the things we find in the Old Testament are for our instruction, that we can learn from them. Well, today we come to a very practical spot in the story of Joseph in Genesis 42, where we're going to gain some lessons. I hope some helpful lessons, some practical lessons, lessons about relationships. Do you have any of those in your life? Do you have any relationships in your life? Let me ask you this question. Do you have any complicated relationships in your life? Do you have any relationships in your life and you step back from it and you think, it's just so complex. My relationship with this person, it seems so complicated. There's always something. There's always a confusion. There's always a conflict. There's always something. It's just so complex. The title of this morning's message is this: relationships are complicated. And we're going to get a glimpse of some relationships, specifically the lives of Joseph's brothers, Jacob, and how that pertains to Joseph. And we're going to learn some things. But this is where we're going to start. Write this down. With this thought, we're going to start. Identifying the realities of complicated relationships. You want to understand what's happening sometimes? Why is a relationship so complicated in your life sometimes? Well, write this down. Passive dependence. Passive dependence. Look with me now at verses 1 to 3. It says, when Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt. Remember, Jacob is Joseph's father. When Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you look at each other? And he said, behold, I've heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die. So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. So the famine is widespread. It gets to Canaan, where Jacob and Joseph's brothers are. And Jacob is like, we're running out of food here. Okay? Now in these verses, we get a clear glimpse into the lives and relationships of Jacob and Joseph's brothers specifically. Up until now, we haven't heard much about Joseph's brothers. The story has been centered on Joseph. Now, the narrative takes us back to Joseph's brothers, and there's a lot to learn here. In many ways, Genesis 42, this chapter we're going to meditate on today, is really what not to do in relationships, is how not to operate in relationships. Verses 1 and 2 tell us that Jacob found out that there was food for sale in Egypt. Apparently his middle-aged sons, they still hadn't figured it out for some reason. They hadn't figured it out, or they just weren't doing anything about it. So Jacob said to them, why do you look at one another? I heard there's grain for sale in Egypt. Go and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die. In other words, Jacob looks at his 10 sons, his 11 sons, and he looks at them and he says, get off the couch. Get out of your pajamas. Put down the video game controller. Wake up and smell the coffee. Take some responsibility here. There's a problem occurring here in this family. It's a problem of passive dependence. Verse 3 then says, so 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. In other words, they were put in their place. And you can picture the scene. They all walked out of the house with their heads down. Dad just told us what to do. Made us feel a little bit embarrassed. We're not taking our responsibilities on the way we need to be taking them on. And so they were put in their place. They walked out of the house with their heads down after being rebuked by Jacob. Jacob, by the way, who appears to be still the primary leader. Now you got to understand, these brothers are middle-aged men with their own families, with their own wives, their own children, and they still live with their father, Jacob. There's a striking and glaring problem here in this family and in their relationships. I wonder if you can see it. In addition to all the accumulated dysfunction that we've read about beginning from Genesis 37 and even before that, there is a problem of passive dependence. It's a culture of passivity. It's a culture of unhealthy dependence. Why is an aging Jacob the one taking full responsibility and bearing the full burden here? Why do the middle-aged brothers seem totally clueless and directionless about where to get food? Now, this is a matter of life and death. He says, go and get food that we may live and not die. Their food supply is getting smaller and smaller. This is a hard situation, and it seems like they don't really know what to do. They're passively dependent on their father, who is aging. The brothers have learned to be passive, and they've developed an unhealthy dependence on their father and perhaps one another. And a major part of the dysfunction in this family from the very beginning has been this kind of passive dependence. If you rewind, you'll read about this. The brothers are learning this from their father. If you rewind a little bit, Jacob has shown himself to be passive. Remember we read in Genesis 37, he favored Joseph so much, and the brothers don't seem to have their lives in order. He always has to send Joseph to go get the brothers. But listen, as Jacob watches the brothers' animosity towards Joseph, notice you'll never read Jacob rebuking them or correcting them. Jacob is very passive, and he's teaching that to his sons. They are passive and they are dependent. They're looking at each other, dependent on their aging father for direction. It's so funny, as I was preparing this message, I was sitting in a coffee shop for part of the time, and the coffee shop was next to a high school. And around 12 o'clock, the high school got out, I guess, for lunch or some kind of break. And so the coffee shop flooded with students. And as I was working, I was facing the an exit door. And so I saw these two teenage students come up and press their faces against the door, banging on the door, waving for their friends to let them in, and nobody's coming. And it was amazing to me because it could have been like several minutes almost of just standing there like this, banging on the door, trying to get in. And I'm thinking to myself, are you serious? Like, you're going to spend minutes standing there instead of taking the 10 seconds to walk all the way around to the front to let yourself in the front door? And I laughed and I thought to myself for a moment, is this a glimpse of this passive generation that fails to take responsibility for their own actions? I thought to myself, is this a glimpse of a generation coming up that seems entitled? Like, instead of taking the responsibility to walk around, it's not really that big a deal, and they're standing there waving for someone to let them in. It's almost comical. And then I thought to myself, well, I probably did the same thing when I was young, so I'm not going to be so hard on them. But isn't that true? Unless we teach, unless we correct these things in us, our sinful nature moves us to a sense of entitlement. Our sinful nature moves us to a sense of, I'll sit back and let someone else do something for me. Our sinful nature tends to move us to a place where I don't have to take responsibility for myself, for my own actions. Someone else will come open the door for me. Someone else will let me in. Someone else will do something for me. Now, there are all kinds of studies that try to prove that certain generations are more entitled than others, and there may be some validity to that, but loved ones, this problem is a problem that transcends every generation and every demographic. The sense of entitlement, passive dependence, a passive disposition, unhealthy dependence on people, a failure to handle our own responsibilities. All of this is really a sin problem. It's not a generation problem. It's not a demographic problem. And so I want to ask you a question today. Do you see this kind of passive dependence in any of your relationships, whether it be family or friends or work relationships? Do you see this kind of passive dependence in your relationships in any way? Have you seen in your own heart the tendency to sit back and depend on someone else and fail to take your own responsibilities seriously? Have you identified this in any of your relationships? When a difficulty comes up in one of your relationships, are you passive about it? You waiting for someone else to lead the way out of the problem? When life is hard for your family, are you willing to proactively own your responsibilities rather than passively sit back and wait for someone else to do something about it? In your relationships, when they get rocky, in your rocky relationships today, perhaps, is it in part because you've chosen to close your eyes to some hard things that need to be addressed? See, what we can learn about in the relationships between Jacob and his brothers, and his sons and their brothers, is there's a sense of passive dependence. And passive dependence is toxic to relationships. It creates unhealthy expectations. It places a burden on people that doesn't need to be placed. It in fact enables sin. I wonder if any of us can identify with that. Identifying the realities of complicated relationships. Passive dependence is one reality of relationships that tend to be complicated. Secondly, complicated relationships are marked by this now, suspicion and fear. Suspicion and fear. I wonder if you can identify with any of that. Notice verses 4 to 5. It says, but Jacob did not send Benjamin. So he sends 10 brothers, but he didn't send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers. For, listen, he feared that harm might happen to him. Thus the sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. So clearly there's a lack of trust in this family. There's a culture of passive dependence, and there's an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. Let me show it to you. You remember years ago that Jacob favored his son Joseph. When he lost Joseph, this was a traumatic event for him. This was traumatizing for him that he lost Joseph. He was totally devastated. By the way, we can add favoritism to the list of unhealthy things that complicate relationships. Remember then that Benjamin was Joseph's full brother, born to Jacob by his favorite wife, Rachel. Rachel had passed away right now. So essentially what's happening here in the story is Joseph's gone, And Jacob tells the brothers, go and get food for us, but I'm keeping Benjamin here. He's not going with you. So there's 11 brothers. He sends 10. He keeps Benjamin close by. Essentially, Jacob is saying, I lost Joseph. I'm not losing Benjamin. He's terrified. But he's also suspicious. He's suspicious of the brothers. Although he doesn't know what the brothers did to Joseph, he's suspicious of them. He knows the character of his sons, and he knows that they have failed to take care of Joseph in the past, and he doesn't trust that they'll take care of Benjamin if he were to go with them to Egypt on this long, dangerous journey to get food. So there's suspicion, and there's fear. And he's suspicious of the sons and doesn't trust them. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers. Here it is. For he feared that harm might happen to him. Loved ones, fear and suspicion in relationships is crippling. And it makes relationships very complex. Whether it's family relationships or whether it's friendships, fear and suspicion complicate things. But some of you will observe, doesn't Jacob have the right to be suspicious of them? Haven't they displayed enough to call their own character into question? Maybe you're sitting here saying, I've been wronged by people in my life, and I actually have a reason to be suspicious of people in my life. Well, how do we handle that? How do we navigate feelings of suspicion and fear in relationships? Here's another question to consider. What if you really can't trust someone? What if they've acted in a way that's created legitimate concerns about their trustworthiness? I'm going to illustrate how we can handle this by going to another portion of Scripture on the screen for you. Acts chapter 15, 36 to 39 records for us an important moment in the life of the Apostle Paul that deals with this very thing. I want you to notice it on the screen. It says, and after some days Paul said to Barnabas, let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord, and see how they are. Now Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul thought best not to take with them the one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. Other translations say that he deserted them. So Paul decides, I don't trust John Mark. Last time he came with us, he deserted us. I don't want to bring him along for the journey. And there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Now, we know that all of this got resolved later. Paul and Barnabas and John Mark, they all got back on the same page. 1 Corinthians 9:6 shows us that. Colossians 4:10, elsewhere. They all figured it out. But how do you navigate feelings of suspicion and fear when you feel like there's legitimate reason for that? Well, I'm going to suggest a few things to you. Write this down. How to navigate feelings of suspicion and fear in my relationships. Write this down. Learn from your experiences with people and walk in wisdom. Okay? Learn from your experiences with people and walk in wisdom. So Paul's experience with John Mark is that he has the propensity to bail out, to desert him. He's done this before, and Paul chooses not to take him with him on this particular trip. He's learned something about his relationship with John Mark. He makes a decision. Doesn't mean he hates him. Doesn't mean he doesn't like him. Doesn't mean he hasn't forgiven him. Just means he makes a decision in wisdom that I'm not going to bring him along on this journey. Now, this doesn't mean that Paul should never trust John Mark ever again. It doesn't mean that Paul shouldn't forgive him. As I said, it doesn't mean that Paul shouldn't love him. Of course not. It doesn't mean any of those things. It doesn't mean that you don't give benefit of the doubt. It certainly doesn't mean that you don't embrace someone. It just means, like Paul, you walk carefully and you walk with wisdom. In some ways, this is what Jacob is doing with his sons. In the midst of the messiness of their family, they've proven that they can't take care of their younger brother, Joseph. Jacob doesn't want to take that risk again, and we'll see later on that this is what Joseph does when he's reunited with his brothers. So how do we navigate feelings of suspicion in our relationships? We need to get to our heart first. We need to make sure that we have legitimate reason to wonder about a person. And it's not just all in our minds and our heads. And if there's legitimate reason, then we can walk in wisdom carefully and learn from our experiences. Now, there's a second thing I want you to see. We got to learn from our experiences with people and walk in wisdom. But secondly, this is important. Don't apply your experiences with certain people to all people. Okay? Don't apply your experiences with certain people to all people. This is how relationships get super complicated and messy. This is a true story. There was a young girl, and she was looking for love, but she was looking for love in all the wrong places. She entered into toxic and abusive relationships over and over and over again. She was so worn and so tired. In her pursuit of love, she came to the conclusion in her heart and mind that she could never ever trust another man. And one day, through a series of circumstances, the young girl heard the gospel of Jesus Christ. And she heard about true love, and she learned about true grace, and she learned about a God who would love her and never leave her, who would love her unconditionally. A God who would set his affections on her unconditionally. And she surrendered her life to Jesus Christ and began actively serving him. And God was changing her life, but she learned very quickly that her past experiences were shaping some of her relationships. She maintained a firm suspicion towards men. No matter how godly, no matter how righteous, no matter how kind the man, she refused to trust a man because of her past experiences. They always reminded her and spoke this lie to her that she would always end up getting hurt every time. And so she had some experiences with certain people, but she was applying those experiences to all people. And she realized that this is not what God wanted for her. Her fear and her suspicion of all men based on the actions of just a few men were hurting her, and any possibility of a fruitful, God-honoring marriage one day with a man. And so she realized that to fully trust God meant to surrender full control of her relationships to God. And she was done trying to control the outcome of her relationship. She was done trying to control with suspicion and fear. And through a long process of growing in her trust of Jesus Christ first, she learned slowly to love others by trusting God first. And no matter what happened, she could trust God with what happened in her life. And she wasn't going to apply her experiences with some people to all people. This is an important thing for us to pay attention to, because it happens to us all the time. And perhaps you're sitting here and you don't even realize that it's happening to you, that you have an inherent suspicion and fear of people. Maybe you're a woman, it's a suspicion of men. Maybe you're a man, it's a suspicion of women. Maybe you're just suspicious of people when they try to get close to you. Why? Because somewhere along the line, someone hurt you. Something happened in your past, and somewhere along the line, someone did something to you, and now you just guard yourself and protect yourself because you don't want that to ever happen to you again. That kind of suspicious attitude and fear, it's what makes relationships so complicated sometimes. It's because when people try to get close, and when people try to love you, when people try to develop an interaction with you, a friendship perhaps, or whatever, they're not sure why you keep doing this to them. They're not sure why you keep, they make a comment maybe, and they didn't mean anything by it, but it triggers something in you that some other person said, and they make a comment, and they don't know what's offended you so badly. And you just pull back and you withdraw. You're like, it's okay. I don't need this relationship right now. Suspicion and fear, it makes relationships very complex. And maybe you're sitting here in this room and you can think to yourself about your relationships, and you can think, man, that sounds like me when I'm dealing with this person. Or that sounds like me when people try to get close to me. Loved ones, it's so important that we understand and see what's happening in the narrative here. Jacob is, in a very unhealthy way, suspicious of his sons. And it's unhealthy because the root of it is sin. It's unhealthy because it's so passive. There's such passive dependence. There's no clear communication. There's favoritism. There's all these things happening in their relationships, and no one is calling it for what it is. And therefore, there's all this dependence and passivity and suspicion and fear. It complicates relationships. Loved ones, John Mark deserted Paul once. It didn't mean that everyone else in the world would desert Paul. And he didn't live that way. He didn't operate that way. And loved ones, when someone hurts you or if someone has hurt you, it doesn't mean that every single person on the planet is going to hurt you. It doesn't mean that. If someone has caused you to be suspicious of their behavior because they legitimately did something wrong to you, fine, walk in wisdom with that person. But don't apply your experience with that person to everyone else. That's what leads to complex and unhealthy relationships. So identifying the realities of complicated relationships, passive dependence, suspicion and fear, and finally, complicated relationships are marked by this. Write this down. Sin and guilt. Sin and guilt. Notice verses 6 to 8. It says, "Now when Joseph was governor over the land, he was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him, and their faces to the ground. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. 'Where do you come from?' he said. They said, 'From the land of Canaan to buy food.' And Joseph recognized his brothers," it tells us again, "but they did not recognize him." Ultimately, loved ones, what we have to see is what has disrupted the relationships in Jacob's family, between Jacob and his sons, and Joseph and his brothers. It's sin. It's sin. Unresolved and unrepentant sin complicates relationships. This is ultimately what's happening here. And in this moment, standing before Joseph are the brothers that have sinned against him violently. He recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. Needless to say, these relationships, Joseph's relationships with his brothers, they're very complicated. Is there any hope for these relationships? Is there any hope for Joseph's relationship with his brothers? Is there any hope for Jacob's relationship with his sons? Is there any hope for these relationships? Would you say that there's hope for these relationships? After the abuse, the betrayal, the deceit, the guilt, the shame that's been bottled up for 20 plus years, is there any hope for these relationships? Let me ask you this question. Has sin marred one of your relationships? Has sin stained one of your relationships in a way you look at and you ask that question legitimately? Is there any hope for these relationships? Well, I believe there is hope. I believe there is hope. I want us to look at 4 questions that we must answer if our relationships have any hope at all. And I want you to think about this in a very personal, practical way. We're going to walk through the rest of the text as we get ready to close now. We're going to walk through the rest of the text, and we're going to look at 4 questions that we have to answer if our relationships have any hope. 4 questions that Joseph is asking in his heart. 4 questions Joseph is processing as his brothers are before him. He sees them, but they don't recognize him. What is he going to do? Is there reconciliation possible here? What does he do here? Well, I want you to write this first question down. Is there any change in my life? Is there any change in my life? Remember, sin and guilt complicate relationships. First question we have to ask, is there any change in my life? Notice verses 9 to 15. It says, "And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them." So, verse 6 shows us that the 10 brothers bowed down before him, just as he dreamed 20 years prior, and he remembers the dreams in this very moment. Here are his brothers bowing down before him, just as the dream said 20 years ago. The text goes on. "And he said to them, 'You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land.' They said to him, 'No, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies.' He said to them," Joseph said to them, "No, it is the nakedness of the land that you have come to see." And they said, "We are your servants. We are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is no more." But Joseph said to them, "It is as I said to you, you are spies. By this you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh you shall not go from this place unless your younger brother comes here." So, the question we need to ask is, why is Joseph being so harsh here? Why is Joseph accusing them of being spies when Joseph fully knows they're not spies? Joseph knows who they are. Why is he being so harsh here? Is it because he's bitter? Is it because he's trying to take revenge on them? Is it because he's like, this is my moment? Just like I dreamed 20 years ago, you're bowing before me, I'm going to set you up. Is that why? That's not the reason. Why? Joseph, loved ones, remembers his dreams. And in his dreams, there were 11 brothers. 11 brothers bowing down, not 10. Before him, he has 10. Okay? There's one missing. And these who have sinned against Joseph, he knows what they're capable of. And before any possibility of reconciliation can take place, Joseph needs to know, have these guys really changed? Have they repented of their sin? Where's the other brother? Did they kill him like they tried to do to me? I mean, we were both born from Rachel. He probably became a favorite to Jacob. Did they kill him like they tried to do to me? Joseph's testing them. Joseph's testing them in this moment. He wants to know, is there change in these brothers? Before there can be reconciliation, he has to know that there's repentance of some kind. And so in this moment, he's wondering, where is Benjamin? And where's my father? Where's Jacob? You traveled all this way. Where's my father? And where's Benjamin? He wants to know if these brothers have changed. And loved ones, if there's any hope for our relationships, you have to understand there needs to be change in our lives. If you've contributed to sin in your relationships that have complicated those relationships, there's no real hope for those relationships unless you're willing to examine your heart. Have I changed? Have I repented of my sin? Have I turned from my sin? That's the way relationships can be restored. Secondly, if our relationships have any hope, we need to ask this question. Do I love the people in my life? Do I genuinely love the people in my life? Or do I want these relationships for other reasons? Do I love them? Notice now verses 16 to 24. Joseph says, send one of you and let him bring your brother while you remain confined, that your words may be tested, whether there is truth in you. Or else by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. So Joseph is testing their love for one another here. Will one of them volunteer to go get Benjamin? I mean, it's a long journey. It's a long journey to Egypt. It's a dangerous journey. Here's another test. Do these brothers love each other? Have they changed? Are they the same as they were 20 years ago? Or what's their commitment to each other? He's testing them. Will one go and volunteer to go get Benjamin? And he put them all together in custody for 3 days. On the third day, Joseph said to them, do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers remain confined where you are in custody, and let the rest go and carry grain for the famine of your households. And bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified, and you shall not die. Here now we have the real test. Will one of them volunteer then to stay in custody while the rest go back? Will one of them volunteer? He's testing their love for each other. Which one is going to say, I'll stay, guys, you go. I'll stay in prison, you go. He's testing their loyalty to each other. He knows these guys. 20 years ago, they betrayed him. They hurt him deeply. They tried to kill him. They sold him in slavery. And as they sold him off, he was like begging them, you're my brothers, don't sell me. And they turned their back on him. Joseph loves them. He wants to reconcile with them. But he's testing them. Have they really changed? Do they really love each other? Verse 20 says, they did so. Then they said to one another, in truth, we are guilty concerning our brother. Notice the guilt now. Notice that they don't know this is Joseph. But all of a sudden, the guilt of what they did to Joseph 20 years ago comes to the surface. Notice what they say. And in truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, and that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us. So these brothers have been living with guilt for 20 years over what they did. Every day they're watching their father Jacob feel so sorrowful over the loss of Joseph. The guilt is piling up in their heart. Guilt complicates relationships. And they're standing there. They don't know this is Joseph. Something bad is happening to them, and they attribute to what's happening to them to the fact that they sinned against Joseph years and years ago. Notice the intense feelings of guilt that they're wrestling with. And Reuben answered them, "Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood." They did not know that Joseph understood them, for there was an interpreter between them. Then he turned away from them and wept. Well, there's Joseph. He wants to reconcile with his brothers. But he wants to know if they've changed. He wants to know if they love one another. This is very complicated. They don't recognize him, and all of a sudden the guilt of 20 years is weighing on them, and they say, "This is happening to us because of what we did to Joseph." And Joseph is hearing them have these conversations, and Joseph is heartbroken. Do I reveal myself to them now? Do I tell them it's me? Do I bring them in? Do I tell them it's going to be okay? No, he stops. He has to test their hearts. And he turns, and Joseph starts to cry. He starts to weep because he loves his brothers, and he sees the turmoil they're in. This relationship, loved ones, is complicated. Is there any hope for it? But Joseph wants to know if they love one another. In this moment, Joseph is heartbroken. He's just learned for the first time that Reuben actually tried to stand up for him and save him. He wants to reveal himself to them because he loves them, but the time has not yet come. The text goes on, "And he returned to them and spoke to them, and he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes." Joseph needs to know if there's true love in this family, if they've learned from their mistakes, if there's been repentance, because you know what has caused the complications in these relationships? It's sin. It's sin, and it's guilt. And so they're bearing the guilt of the sin they committed 20 years ago, and they're bearing it in its full weight probably right now in this moment, not even realizing that their brother is standing before them. There needs to be real change. That's the only way the relationship can be restored. Thirdly, third question. If our relationships have any hope, we need to ask this question. Am I committed to integrity in my life? Am I committed to integrity in my life? Notice verses 25 to 28 then. "And Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, and to replace every man's money in his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. This was done for them." Here's another test. Joseph puts their money back in their bags to see how they will respond. They will turn back. Will they turn back? Will they return it? Will they run away with it? Joseph's testing them again. Is there integrity in my brothers? Because there needs to be change if our relationship is going to be reconciled. Then they loaded their donkeys with grain and departed. And as one of them opened his sack to give his donkey fodder at the lodging place, he saw his money in the mouth of his sack. He said to his brothers, "My money has been put back here. It is in the mouth of my sack." At this their hearts failed them, and they turned trembling to one another, saying, "What is this God has done to us?" You have to understand, they're emotionally reeling from what's going on here. They're terrified that they're in trouble in the palace. And now they're walking back, and they find the money returned to them in their bag. And they're terrified, they're freaked out. Joseph's done it. He's planted it on purpose to test the integrity of their hearts. Remember, Joseph loves them. He wants to reconcile with them. But he needs to know that they've changed. Remember, 20 years ago, they sold Joseph for a bag of silver. And here Joseph, 20 years later, replaces all their money in their bags. Are they going to sell out on Simeon? They got grain. They got money. Are they going to sell out Simeon, who's in custody, like they sold me out? He's testing their hearts. And loved ones, without a commitment to integrity, this relationship cannot be restored. Without a commitment to integrity, loved ones, our complex and broken relationships cannot be restored. Final question we must ask and answer if our relationships have any hope. Not only is there any change in my life, not only do I love the people in my life, not only am I committed to integrity in my life, but finally, have the people closest to me seen a change in my life? That's the last question you need to ask. If your relationships have any hope. have the people closest to me seen a change in my life? Notice now verses 29 to 38. When they came to Jacob their father, so they got all the way back home in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them. Now verse 30 to 34 recap all that we've already read, so I'm not going to read it again. Jump down to verse 35. As they emptied their sacks, behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. So they just realized that not only was the money returned to one of them, the money was returned to all of them. And when they and their father saw their bundles of money, they were afraid. And Jacob their father said to them, you have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more. And now you would take Benjamin. All this has come against me. Notice that Jacob blames them for the loss of Joseph. He doesn't know the details, but he's suspicious of them. He blames them for Joseph. They didn't take care of Joseph. What is Jacob saying? Essentially, Jacob is saying, I don't trust you guys. I don't trust you. What are you doing? You come back here with all this grain and all your bags are full of money. What did you do? Did you steal it? Joseph's gone. Simeon is gone. Now you want to take Benjamin? I don't trust you. Has Jacob seen a change in the lives of the brothers? This is what Joseph wants to test. Is there change in these guys? Can we be reconciled to one another? Are they still going to be doing the same things they've always been doing? Caring about themselves, worrying about themselves, cheating people. And so one of the tests is, will Jacob trust them enough to release Benjamin to them? Joseph's testing them. Loved ones, in many ways, these are 4 tests that we have to put against our own hearts today. If you find yourself in complicated relationships, if you find yourself in difficult relationships, if you find yourself in relationships that seem like they have no hope, maybe it's a marriage, it's a friendship, it's a relationship between you and your children, it's a sibling relationship, it's a relationship with someone in the church. You look at it, you ask the question, does this relationship have any hope? Well, we need to put these 4 questions up against our hearts. I'm going to put them on the screen for you right now again. Is there any change in my life? Because what has caused the disruption in our relationships? It's sin. It's sin. Have I sinned in a way that has caused a complication in my relationship? Am I continually in a pattern of sin in my relationships that causes complication in my relationships? If you want to know if there's hope for relationships, you need to ask yourself the question, not have they changed as much, but is there change in my life? Is there change in my life? Second question, do I love the people in my life? You ask yourself that question. Why do I want this relationship to proceed? Why do I want this relationship to be strong? Why do I want this relationship to be vibrant? Why do I want hope for this relationship? Is it for a selfish ambition? Is it a selfish motive? Or do I really love these people? You have to ask yourself that question. Is there any change in my life? Do I love the people in my life? Thirdly, am I committed to integrity in my life? Am I committed to reconciling relationships and bearing under the weight of my own responsibilities in the relationships? Not being passive in the relationship, but carrying my weight and being someone of integrity. Joseph tests their integrity by putting the money in their sacks. And then I want you to ask this question of yourself. Have the people closest to me seen a change in me? Maybe you've had a broken relationship lately and you've gone to the people closest to you and say, this person won't trust me, this person won't reconcile, I keep apologizing, I keep asking for forgiveness, and the people closest to you say, but you haven't changed. You got to change. You got to repent of your sin. You got to own your stuff. And you got to change. Do the people closest to you see change in your life? Loved ones, I believe there's hope for our relationships if they're in disarray. There's hope if there's change. There's hope if there's love. There's hope if there's integrity. There's hope if our change can be affirmed by other people. There's hope, loved ones, in a greater Joseph. There's hope in the person of the Lord Jesus Christ. Joseph is a picture to us of a greater deliverer, Jesus Christ. And maybe you're here today and your relationships are broken, they're in disarray, they're in shambles. Some of your relationships are beyond repair in your mind. Are you willing to come to the greater Joseph, Jesus Christ, and say, Lord, I surrender this relationship to you, and I surrender my life to you. Change me. Give me true love for the people in my life. Help me to be a man of integrity. Right now we can begin to do that, turning our eyes to the greater Joseph, which is Jesus Christ, and allowing him to change us and mold us. I want you to stand to your feet right now and bow your heads. I'm going to pray for you.